Imagine walking onto a used car lot, handing over $20,000, and driving home in what you think is a solid workhorse Ute. 2 months later, you're back at the mechanic, staring at a repair bill that makes your stomach drop. That nightmare happens more than you'd think, and the scary part is that the Utes sitting on those lots right now look perfectly fine from the outside. So before you spend a single dollar on a used Ute in 2026, you need to hear what 7 real Australian mechanics had to say, because some of what they told us was genuinely shocking. These are guys who spend every single day under the hood of these vehicles, and not one of them held back. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you might completely change your mind about which Ute you were planning to buy. Welcome to the Drive Intel, the channel where we dig deeper than the brochure and give you the real story about the cars and trucks that matter to everyday drivers. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now and turn on notifications, because we put out content like this every single week that could literally save you thousands of dollars. And if you've ever been burned by a bad used vehicle purchase, drop a comment below. We want to hear your story. Now, before we get into the list, let me explain how we put this together. We reached out to mechanics from different parts of Australia, Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth, Sydney, and a couple from regional areas, because regional mechanics see something that city mechanics often miss. They see these Utes being absolutely flogged on farms, construction sites, and outback roads. Their perspective is gold. We asked each one the same simple question. If your mate came to you tomorrow and said he was buying a used Ute, which ones would you tell him to walk away from? The answers gave us a very clear picture, and we're going to walk you through every single one. Let's start with the one that almost every single mechanic brought up without us even prompting them. The Volkswagen Amarok, specifically the first generation models, from around 2011 through to 2020, kept coming up in conversation after conversation. Now, before the Amarok fans in the comments start typing, hear us out. On paper, the Amarok sounds like a dream. Refined ride, powerful diesel engine, European build quality. And honestly, when it's running well, it is a genuinely impressive machine. The problem is when it stops running well, and with used examples, that happens far too often for comfort. Our mechanic from Perth, who has been working on Utes for over 15 years, told us that the Amarok's timing chain issues on the V6 TDI engine are among the most expensive surprises he's had to break to customers. He said, and we're paraphrasing here, that he's seen timing chain failures come in with barely any warning, and by the time the owner noticed something was off, the damage was already deep into the engine internals. Repairs on those jobs can push well past $10,000. And that's before you even talk about the dual mass flywheel, which on these first-gen Amaroks tends to give up the ghost pretty reliably once you're past 150,000 kilometers. Another mechanic from Brisbane mentioned the AdBlue system causing headaches on higher kilometer examples, especially ones that spent time towing heavy loads regularly. The parts situation makes it worse. Unlike the Japanese Utes, Volkswagen parts in Australia are not cheap, and depending on where you live, you might be waiting weeks for components to arrive. One regional mechanic told us he had a customer wait nearly 3 weeks for a part that, on a Toyota, would have been at his door the next morning. So the Amarok is a beautiful Ute when it works, but the used market in 2026 is full of first-gen examples that are ticking time bombs, and unless you have a very thorough pre-purchase inspection from someone who specifically knows Volkswagen diesels, it's a serious gamble. Moving on, and this one might surprise a few people, several of our mechanics flagged the Ford Ranger in specific configurations, particularly the higher kilometer 3.2-liter 5-cylinder diesel models from the PX1 and PX2 generation. Now, the Ranger is Australia's best-selling Ute, so statistically there are more of them on the used market than anything else. That's actually part of the problem. Because there are so many of them, there are also a lot of poorly maintained, hard-worked examples floating around, and sellers know how to make them look presentable for a sale. A Melbourne mechanic we spoke to was very specific about what worries him. He said the EGR cooler on those 3.2 engines is a known weak point, and on high-kilometer examples that have spent their lives towing or doing heavy work, it's almost guaranteed to need attention. He's seen EGR failures lead to coolant getting into places it absolutely should not be, and the downstream damage from that can be catastrophic. He also pointed out that the 6-speed automatic gearbox on some of these models, particularly ones that were used commercially, can show significant wear, and a gearbox rebuild on a Ranger is not a cheap exercise. To be clear, the mechanics we spoke to were not saying avoid the Ranger entirely. The newer Ranger models, particularly from 2022 onwards, are a different story. What they were saying is that a high-kilometer PX1 or PX2 Ranger, especially one that looks like it's lived a tough commercial life, needs to be inspected extremely carefully before you put money down. The used market is absolutely flooded with these right now, and not all of them have been looked after. The next one on the list generated some really interesting conversation. The Mitsubishi Triton, particularly the MQ generation from 2015 to 2018, came up multiple times. And the thing that mechanics kept coming back to was not one catastrophic failure point, but rather a pattern of accumulated issues that show up together on higher kilometer examples. The rear differential, the front CV joints, and the transfer case on those MQ models can all start making noise and causing problems around the same time if the vehicle has been used hard off-road or for regular towing. One of our Sydney mechanics said that the MQ Triton is the Ute, where he sees owners make the classic mistake of buying it because the price looks great, only to discover that the low price was reflecting a whole list of things that needed fixing. He said he's had customers bring in MQ Tritons where the quoted repair list came out longer than the purchase price they paid for the vehicle. He was particularly pointed about used examples that show signs of heavy off-road use without a documented service history, saying that those should be avoided completely unless you're prepared to rebuild essentially the entire drivetrain. The diesel engine itself on the MQ Triton is generally considered reasonably durable, but the timing belt, not chain, needs to be serviced at specific intervals, and there's been a history of owners either missing those intervals or not having documentation to prove it was done. A snapped timing belt means engine damage, and on a vehicle where the price looked attractive, suddenly the economics fall apart very quickly. Now let's talk about one that a couple of our more experienced mechanics brought up, and it's one you might not see discussed as much online. The Holden Colorado, specifically the 7th generation models from the RG series, around 2012 through to 2020, was flagged for a very specific reason. The 2.8-liter Duramax diesel in these trucks is actually considered a pretty solid engine by most mechanics, and we want to be honest about that. But the issue that kept coming up was not the engine itself, it was everything around it. The electricals on the older RG Colorados have developed a reputation for gremlins as these vehicles age. One of our mechanics from Queensland described chasing intermittent electrical faults on these as genuinely one of the more frustrating jobs in his workshop, because the issues can appear and disappear, making them incredibly hard to diagnose and expensive to fix properly. He also mentioned that because Holden no longer exists as a brand, some owners of these Utes are starting to feel the pinch when it comes to dealer support and warranty backup on repairs. There's also the rust concern, particularly on examples from coastal areas or those used on farms where they've been exposed to moisture, mud, and agricultural chemicals. Rust on the chassis rails of these trucks can be hidden under seal and only becomes visible once you get the vehicle on a hoist. Several of our mechanics said they make it an absolute non-negotiable to get any used Colorado up on a hoist before recommending a purchase, because what looks fine from the outside can be genuinely concerning underneath. This brings us to the LDV T60, and this is where the conversation got really direct. Multiple mechanics were very clear that they would never advise someone to buy a used LDV T60, particularly earlier models. The T60 was marketed aggressively on price, and a lot of buyers were drawn in by how much UT they appeared to be getting for the money. The problem is that in the used market, the true cost of ownership on these vehicles starts to reveal itself. Parts availability is a genuine issue that mechanics flagged repeatedly. One of our regional mechanics said he had a customer with an LDV T60 that needed a specific component, and the wait time was measured in months, not weeks. During that time, the truck was sitting in his workshop completely unusable. That's a real-world problem, especially for someone who depends on their Ute for work. The build quality concerns that some reviewers noted when these trucks were new become amplified on used examples because everything that was marginal when new has now had years of wear on it. The resale trajectory on these is also something mechanics pointed to as a warning sign rather than a benefit. Yes, you can buy one cheaply, but when it comes time to sell or trade, the value has often dropped further than almost anything else in the segment. And if something goes wrong, finding a mechanic who is genuinely experienced with these vehicles outside of major cities can be a real challenge. Our last two picks from the mechanics were perhaps the most nuanced, because they weren't blanket condemnations, but very specific warnings about specific variants or circumstances. The Toyota HiLux was mentioned, but only in very specific terms, and we want to get that nuance right. The HiLux, particularly the N80 generation from 2015 onwards, is still regarded by most mechanics as one of the most reliable Utes on the market. But what a couple of our mechanics flagged was the turbo diesel variants that have been used in commercial fleets and are now cycling into the used market with very high kilometers and variable service histories. One mechanic put it very plainly. He said the HiLux is a fantastic Ute, but people sometimes buy the brand's reputation rather than the actual vehicle in front of them, and a neglected HiLux is still a neglected vehicle. He mentioned specific attention needed on the injectors and fuel system on high-kilometer fleet examples, and cautioned that just because it's a HiLux doesn't mean the used example you're looking at has been looked after. A thorough inspection is still essential regardless of the badge. The final mention from our group was the Isuzu D-Max in a specific context. Not the newer model, but used examples from the first generation that were used commercially and are now presenting at attractive price points. The diesel engine in these is considered exceptionally robust, but the issue flagged was around body integrity on commercial use examples, and specifically the rust protection on older models, holding up less well than owners expected, particularly in tropical or coastal regions of Australia. So there you have it. 7 mechanics and a very honest picture of which used Utes are carrying the most risk heading into 2026. The pattern that comes through in almost every single case is the same. It's not necessarily that these are bad Utes when they're new. It's that the used market in 2026 contains a lot of high-kilometre, hard-worked examples that have not been maintained properly. And the combination of those factors with certain known mechanical vulnerabilities creates real financial risk for buyers. The single most consistent piece of advice across all 7 mechanics was to never skip a pre-purchase inspection from an independent mechanic who knows the specific model you're looking at. Not a quick look over, a proper inspection on a hoist with a diagnostic scan tool and someone who will give you a written report. That inspection might cost you a couple of $100s, but it can save you from spending tens of thousands on a vehicle that turns into a money pit. At the Drive Intel, our whole mission is to give you exactly this kind of real-world, no-nonsense information so that when you're making big financial decisions about vehicles, you're doing it with your eyes wide open. If this video helped you or gave you something to think about, please share it with someone you know who is currently shopping for a used Ute. Because honestly, the information in this video could save them a serious amount of money and stress. Drop a comment below and tell us which Ute you're currently driving or considering buying. We read every single comment, and it genuinely helps us know what topics to cover next. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Drive Intel and hit the like button on this video. It really does make a difference in helping us reach more people who need this kind of content. We'll see you in the next one.